Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafeez. We aim to bring you the best macro analysis to help you successfully invest in financial markets. For our latest analysis, visit macrohive.com.
This one I probably would love to hear is around how do you manage? I know you asked this question, but I mean, everyone at Macro Hive knows that you consume so much research and information and studying and books yourself. How do you manage all of that input on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, I have a very kind of, over the years, I've refined my approach, and I have a kind of a very structured approach, which starts from the time I get out of bed, where what the first thing I do when I get out of bed is I make sure I don't check any electronic devices when I first wake up.
Except your phone.
Don't be my phone. Yeah,
I know, I'm kidding.
And the reason for that is I want to be able to note down all the ideas that have been mulling in my head, like I've sort of slept on. I want to kind of capture them unfiltered. So when I have my shower, so first thing I have my shower, inside my shower, I have a waterproof notebook where I write down all the stuff that comes to my mind when I wake up. So I also often have like a million ideas when I wake up in the morning about I should look at this, I look at it. So I note that all down. Then I have then I do a little workout in the morning, just a really sort of basic one. And then depending on if I'm coming to the office or not, so we have an office in central London, which people are welcome to come by to say hi to us. So on the commute in, which normally takes about 40 minutes or so, I sort of break that down. Part of that I listen to a podcast. So I'm a massive podcast listener. So I listen to podcasts. It could be on macro, could be on crypto, could be on tech, could be on anything. So I listen to that at like the 1.5 to 2 times speed. So half my journey I'm listening to a podcast. Then the other half I start to check all my messages and process all of that, and then go through sort of Twitter and stuff like that, and keep aside pieces I want to read. And then during my work day, I try to, as much as possible, although I've lost a bit of my discipline here, in general, I only like to check my messages or emails or Slack messages 3 times a day. First thing in the morning, once at lunch, and once at the end of the day. In between, I basically don't want to be impacted by that all. Yeah. The reason I say that is when you start a task, so let's say I'm starting to write a research note or something like that, most people, like within 5-10 minutes, they go to Slack or their email and check, something, The problem with that is, number one, you've just started something, you then check that thing, and then that thing then makes you pushes you down some little rabbit hole that you weren't thinking about before. It forces your mind to switch to a different topic. You end up going down that rabbit hole. And then you realize, actually, I've got to finish my task. You come back to your task. It takes you about 5 minutes, 10 minutes to get back into that mode.
Right.
And then you've ended up becoming massively inefficient. And so what I find is you basically have to you have to single task all the time. So what I do is I split my day up so that in the morning, I'm a morning person. So I do more of the intensive research stuff uninterrupted. So you can just power through it all. And that increases your productivity, I would say, like 4 or 5-fold. People who, the same, somebody who would interrupt their day would end up, even if they, in theory, spend the same number of minutes as me on a research thing, I'll probably produce 4 times as much as they do. And that's one of the reasons why you see my output is so prolific, even though I work like 9 to 5. I'm very tight with my time. Then I check my messages at lunch, and then I set time aside then for different tasks. So then I set a time aside, okay, all my emailing I will do now between these hours. All my calls I'll do, so I group sort of tasks together in that way. Then on the way back home.
And obviously a lot of like client interactions I know you always like to have in that period in the afternoon.
Yeah, exactly. So afternoons are kind of more everything on that side. Then on the way home, I normally start reading. That's the point I start reading. So normally I either listen to a podcast that's not related to finance and I start reading whatever book I'm reading. Then when I come home, normally it's just family time, which takes priority to whatever the family want to do. I just do that. And then in the evening, I might squeeze in like an hour of reading in the evening. And I can speed read as well, which kind of helps, you know, so I can get books through really, really sort of quickly. And I usually have 2 books running at the same time. One is a fiction book and one's a non-fiction book. And then on weekends, I usually squeeze in a couple of hours a day reading. So that's generally my kind of structure. It's kind of fairly disciplined, take notes of stuff as I go along. And you end up, you know, with a lot of sort of productivity.
Yeah. Maybe we should put some of that, actually, just thinking now in the notes as well.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people would really appreciate that. Because I think a lot of people, most people in today's world are have that as an issue. Is like, how do you better manage your time? How are you most effective in consuming information and being most productive? So I guess last question, you mentioned books. Any books you feel that have influenced your thinking towards markets or business the most?
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to books, I'm going to give a long list now because this is like, I love books and people often ask me as well. So I might as well just give kind of a long list of books, but on the kind of the finance,
and all the stuff will be on the notes.
Yeah, we'll include everything on the show notes. In terms of books related to markets and finance and doing my job, there's a couple of books that I found really influential. One is Nassim Taleb's books. You know, he's written a series of books. The Black Swans is probably the one that you know, I found really sort of useful. The main takeaway from that book was, you know, unexpected things happen a lot more than you think, and lots of smart people don't know what they're talking about. That's kind of the punchline of his book, which is quite powerful. Now, his personality is very grating, you know, that kind of makes him entertainment. By the way. But it's quite fun to read. I think that's definitely a very good book. The other book, I think, which I only discovered in recent years, is a book by the Oxford physicist David Deutsch. He's wrote this book called The Beginning of Infinity, which is really an amazing book about how to think about science, the difference between scientific explanations and empiricism, you know, where, you know, what is a scientific theory, the power of creativity in humans, what makes humans special. Really eye-opening book. So I'd recommend that book. Another book by Phil Tetlock called Super Forecasting. You know, he's done a lot of work in how to forecast well. Great book. Another one would be J.K. Galbraith. He was a great writer in his time, and he wrote this book called The Great Crash, 1929, where he goes through, you know, what happened during the Great Crash, stock market crash of 29. And it's a great, like, financial historical book, and it's written really, really well. Liar's Poker, great book by Michael Lewis. You know, many people from my generation read that. You know, it's about the early days of Salomon. Some junior guy joins the trading desk there, and it talks about all the crazy stuff they did there. Then another book which actually goes back to sort of the productivity side is there's this book written in 1940 by this advertising guy called James Webb Young called A Technique for Producing Ideas, where he talks about how he systematically generates ideas. Great book. So on the market side, I'd recommend those books. Then on the startup side, you know, because I read a lot of books on startups before I set up MacroHive, and there's 2 books that probably stayed with me the most. One was a book by Jason Fried, who's the CEO and founder of Basecamp, which is kind of like a rival to Slack, and it's called Rework. And he came up with a later book, which called It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work. And his whole idea was, when you start up a company, especially a startup, it's really easy to get caught up in the whole VC grow quickly mentality. But he said, actually, no, don't do that. You know, go for patient growth and steady growth. And in the long run, that will work out to be better. And so that really kind of stayed with me. The other book on the startup side was Bloomberg, written by Michael Bloomberg, where he talks about his life story. And what I liked about that book a lot was he was a big shot at Salomons in the 70s, and he left Salomons to set up Bloomberg. So he talked about the transition of being a big shot at big bank to becoming a startup guy, setting up Bloomberg. And he talked about how he'd have to like go to offices with a screwdriver and screw in and put someone's terminal into a second-rate bank. You know, before that, he was this big shot at Salomons. So he really talked about the hard grind of a startup. And that was really important for me when I started MacroHive, where I'd been a senior guy at big banks, and suddenly, you know, you're having to do things that you haven't, you know, thought like, you know, my level of seniority, whatever, I shouldn't be doing this. And you're speaking to having to pitch to people you thought, oh my God, would I ever have to pitch to these people? So that was quite humbling,
Right.
and a really good perspective. So that was a good book on startups. Then I want to mention another bunch of books on the more personal side,
Sure.
you know, because I think that it's very important to make sure that you do some internal work in life in general, but also even in finance. So there's a few books that have really impacted me kind of at the personal level in terms of personal growth. One is the works of Rumi. So Rumi is this 13th century mystic, Sufi poet, you know, lived in Turkey. And he's written these reams of like poetry and what I like about Rumi is that he talks about the mundane, the day-to-day stuff you do, working or studying or whatever it is, and he sort of turns that into something more sacred in some ways, or more powerful. So we'll talk about like, don't forget the purpose of life when you're doing day-to-day work, you know, like how do you avoid being a judgmental person? But the way he talks about it is so clever that stays with you. And he's one of the most widely read poets to this day, and there's reason for that. The other is the works of Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare is amazing in terms of understanding human nature. I like the tragedies more than the comedies or the histories. So, and Othello is my favorite. But the way he kind of talks about how people can just self-sabotage is really quite amazing. Like, you know, you always, whether it's Othello, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, there's all these characters who are in really powerful positions, and then they do stuff that completely sabotages themselves, you know. And he, you know, talks on themes of jealousy, insecurity, paranoia, all of these sorts of things. Now, obviously, Shakespeare isn't that accessible to a lot of people because the language is a bit, you know, is quite difficult to read. So over the years, I've found ways of accessing Shakespeare differently. So there's one series of books called No Fear Shakespeare, where it has the original text and then it translates it into modern English. So that was quite an easy way for me to read. Yeah. And there's actually a manga series, comic book series of all the Shakespeare plays, which is really good. Then also there's film adaptations of Shakespeare that are very good. So, you know, a classic, a basic one is Lion King is actually based on Hamlet. It's actually pretty much the same story as Hamlet. But the two best films on Shakespeare are actually Asian films. There's one Indian film called Omkara, which is based on Othello, which is really works well because India has a caste system. And so there's the play with Othello, who is black in a white world, works really well. And there's this Japanese film called Ran, which is based on King Lear, which was made by Akira Kurosawa, the famous director, which is an amazing film about King Lear, which is quite accessible. So those are some books on that side. I would also throw in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. So he was the 2nd century AD sort of philosopher king of Roman Empire. He's like the archetype of what a philosopher king could be. He appeared in the movie Gladiator at the beginning. The father of Commodore was Marcus Aurelius. Right. But his meditations are great. It's part of the Stoic tradition where it talks a lot about the way you think about things. It's almost like the reality you see in the world is how you think about the world. So if you change your thought process, like cognitive behavioral therapy almost, you'll change the way you see the world, and that's in your control. So you don't need the world to change. If you change your mindset, that will change your experience of the world. And then finally, I'll just round this off with a couple of kind of more, self-helpy type books. But one book I found really, really helpful, and this will really appeal to men, I think, is How to Improve Your Marriage Without Talking About It by Patricia Lowe. Fantastic book, where it talked about how often when you have a rough patch in your marriage or an argument or something, there's this sort of notion that you should talk it out. But often that is the worst thing you can do because it for lots of different reasons, you have to read the book to do that. But it's a really, really good book of how to get through the rocky parts of marriage or relationships. The other good book is a book called Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, an amazing book about language, how you can use language in a way that's not violent to the other person, isn't judgmental to the other person. And then the final book is two books, Raising Boys and Raising Girls by Stephen Budolf, where he kind of talks about how you should raise either boys or girls. and different ages, what you should do at different ages, and things like that. Really, 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 really good
I'll have
stuff.
to check that one. Yeah.
So anyway, so that's the reading list.
That's a lot. But of course, we'll have all that stuff in the show notes. And as always, I think we'd love to hear people's feedback. Some of those books sound super interesting. And, I think I don't know if I mentioned to you, I've been kind of trying to learn a bit more about Stoicism itself. And I find that super interesting. So I think I know the answer, but make sure everyone knows is what's the best way to connect with you or see on a consistent basis kind of your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the easiest way is just go to macrohive.com. So that's where you see a lot of kind of my work, but not all of it. So if you're a member of Macrohive, you'll see kind of the output of the team, especially on crypto, equities, and some macro. Then for all of my more deeper market views, models, all the stuff I talked about earlier, we have a higher sort of product for professionals and institutional investors. So if you're more for a professional investor or institutional investor, we have a product where you can just email me and I can tell you how you can receive that. And that basically has all the model portfolio, the trade ideas. It's like regular chats, Bloomberg chats. It's a very sort of high-end product that's comparable, if not better, than what you could get from the sell side, if I don't say so myself. So that's one thing. Then I'm on
and
Twitter,
also the
LinkedIn,
internal
and so
Slack
on as
room.
well.
People can even reach out to you.
Yeah, so if people want to reach out to me, email bilal@macrohive.com. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, and then on Slack as well. You can reach out to me on Slack or on Bloomberg as well.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. I mean, it's been super interesting. I feel like I've learned a lot. So I'm sure a lot of traditional podcast listeners over the last kind of year and a half will find this. Hopefully they'll find this very interesting, but also very informative. So awesome. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.